So you've walked up a hill overlooking a town, a scenic spot, and you've got a little bit of time before you have to head back, and you want to catch your breath, and maybe you've got some coffee or something nice to have up the top while you enjoy the view. So what are you going to do? You've got half an hour till you head back down. Well, of course, you whip out your sketchbook and you do a drawing, a nice little drawing of the view and of the time for your memories. Now, I think this is in Yorkshire somewhere, and it may even be near a place called, I think it could be called Castletown. This is going back a long time, this trip. So I'm not so certain, but it's definitely in Yorkshire somewhere in the north of England. And it's a lovely view, and I cropped a larger photo to just make it a little bit quicker. But because I think it's the sort of slice of the view that I would choose to draw rather than a longer, wider view where I would have far less chance, I think, of getting a satisfactory drawing in a reasonably short period of time. And I start with these trees down the front. And the thing that I have to keep remembering is that this is going to be a fast drawing, and I can't afford to get bogged down in trees. And the trees, these aren't even the main part. They're a bit of a lower frame in some ways, and so they're nice to have there. But it's really going to be the village and the view going further back into the distance that matters. And so with some of these trees, I do add a bit of what I think of as notional hatching to really more represent the colour rather than any shade or shadow that's happening. Even though there's not much variation in life, I think it just adds a little more interest and perhaps makes them look more like trees rather than some long blob across the bottom. I'm using a 0.3mm pen at this stage, and I switch to a 0.1 when I get past this lower part of the town. So I start with these houses on the lower left. Now with this sort of scene, again, it's very important not to try and draw too much, and even more so in life when you can see a lot more than what we can see from a reference photo this size. It can be tempting to put too much detail in, particularly if you know the subject well. If you've drawn these sorts of cottages or these sorts of village streets closer up, it can be tempting to try and draw way too much. We need to suggest just enough detail that it becomes clear what we have. So we want to have those little chimneys because they silhouette nicely against darker forms. We certainly want that church tower. The church is, I suppose, the reason I chose this particular slice of a wider panoramic view. And we want to use some of these darker trees as contrast. And we want to make sure that we don't go too high with our detail too quickly. When I look at drawings that are of similar scenes, a common fault that I see with them is that the details, such as these sloping lines of trees or houses, go too high up the picture too quickly. And what that does is we lose the kind of the slope and the sense of distance. It makes things happen visually too quickly for the scale that we really have. We want things to move back a long way on a semi-horizontal plane for as long as possible, because that gives a greater sense of distance. There is quite a good depth in this view, and we want to capture that. So again, I'm really working hard to just keep this nice and loose, and really doing little more than suggesting roof lines and chimneys and trees. The other important thing is to get the perspective angles of the buildings correct and of the roofs correct, and the foreshortening of the length of buildings when we're viewing them more end on. It's easy to just let them go too far and not to foreshorten them enough, and then we have that creep up the page faster than we should, or faster than we want. Now, we have to, I think, in this sort of drawing, have a compromise between being so careful in our observation and accurate in placing fairly small details that we just take far too long, and been so imaginative that it doesn't bear any relationship to the village or the view that we actually have. So I'm trying to be approximately accurate. I would like to think that someone who knew this view and knew this village would be able to recognise it, but I'm not worrying too much where the corners of buildings line up with corners of buildings and so forth. More important is I get the sweep of the view and the scale, that the buildings and the trees in particular get smaller as they go back in the right proportion. Because it's going to be the trees in particular that will give a sense of distance, because they're the one constant that we have. We do have the buildings going back some distance in the lower part, but for the upper part where we get the real distance happening, it really is the trees that we need to use to convey just that distance. And I'm trying to keep these all fairly loose. I'm just going a bit dark now around the tower, and I exaggerate that a little bit. And now we have the street. I decided to cross-hatch the street horizontally rather than leave it blank. I don't know if that was the best idea. If I were doing this again, I probably wouldn't do that, or I would use a much finer pen just to create a lighter grey. I think that maybe was my mistake. I shouldn't have used the same pen that I drew the line work around it. This drawing took me just a little bit over 30 minutes to draw. It was just under 20 minutes what we've done so far. We've sort of passed in my mind, the halfway point of the drawing, not the time. And it was just over 10 minutes for the rest of it. And I have switched to the 0.1mm pen, which unfortunately I think I must have dropped it at some point without realising, or bumped it, because the end isn't particularly happy. It either gives no line, or it seems to give a line 2 or 3 times as thick as it should. So it looks like there's a trip to the art supply shop. And now I'm just trying to work out, you can see me trying to work out what's wrong with this pen, trying to see the nib enough to see if I can work out the problem. Yep, still not happy with it. But not so unhappy that I went to the trouble of trying to find a new one. So I'm trying not to get too lost in these trees, these smallish trees in the centre. And this is probably where I'm least faithful to the reference. And now I'm really having to think hard about getting the scale smaller as we go further back. And just measuring up the distances. Obviously easier with a photo than in life. In a photo, this 3-dimensional scene is already 2 dimensions, which is why it's easier to draw from a photo than from life. In life, we still have it in 3 dimensions in front of us, and while that has lots of wonderful advantages, one of the first things we need to do is to convert it into 2 dimensions onto our paper. And that can be a challenging task depending on the scene and the angle, whereas in our case, the camera has done that for us already. So these lines of trees is probably the most significant visual effect we need to get, because the lines convey angles, and they also convey the slope of the land, and they also convey distance, receding distance. So it's actually important to capture them as accurately as possible. Again, if we want this to look, firstly, simply like a realistic view of fields moving backwards towards a hill, or a ridge, we would call this in Australia. I'm not sure if you use the word ridge in Yorkshire, towards a ridge in the background. It's important that these angles are correct and that the trees get smaller in the right way with the right scale. I mean, obviously some trees are just smaller, but where we have clearly a row of trees that are all the same size, then we want to get that scale correct. And I want to draw it with a lighter touch as well. I have a 0.05mm pen, which I don't know if it's just very fine or if it's half out of ink. Probably I should buy a new one and check it out. But I use that for the very upper part of the drawing. Here I am. I really don't like drawing with pens this fine, but I think for this sort of drawing, it's a good tool to resort to, just to get that real sense of we're way back in a far more significantly distant way when we get up to that part. Now it's a real compromise here of drawing enough lines so we know what we're looking at, but not drawing so many lines that we make it feel closer. We really are just suggesting the distance. If this were a painting, these would be just very faint, soft blobs of very dull colour. I often have flashbacks to my oil painting decade that I had before I began doing this drawing, and think about the techniques that I would use to represent the shapes and the form and the distances, the how I would render the effects. And many of the techniques that I developed as I did the oil painting were surprisingly handy when I began to draw. There's an awful lot in common. It's why I talk about going deep in a certain area, a certain medium is a good way to start a creative, artistic journey, rather than trying your hand at lots of things where we end up getting not very good at any of them. If we learn skills and learn them well in a few areas, then we can overflow those skills into other areas and get a head start when we do start those other areas. I'm hoping when I start watercolour soon that my drawing practice works that way. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope you found this interesting. If you'd like to have a go drawing this sort of panoramic or aerial view of a Yorkshire village, then you'll find it on my channel community page. But whatever you draw and however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.